The pounding on his door jolted Carlos from a fitful sleep. Before he could fully register what was happening, the door to his quarters burst open, admitting 4 figures in tactical gear, their faces obscured by polarized visors. "Fisher, on your feet, now!" The lead figure's voice was distorted by a vocal modulator, lending an inhuman quality to the already harsh command. Carlos scrambled upright, disoriented by the sudden intrusion. His quarters on SC Treasure 11 Primary Station had been his sanctuary since the disastrous countermeasure attempt 3 days earlier, a place to process the catastrophic failure and search for new approaches to the repository threat. "What the hell is?" His question died as 2 of the tactical team seized him by the arms, hauling him bodily from the bed. The other 2 moved with practiced efficiency, scanning the room with specialized equipment that emitted a soft blue glow. "No time," snapped the lead figure. "Security breach, station compromised." Carlos tried to resist, his scrounger instincts flaring with suspicion. These weren't standard corporate security. Their equipment was too specialized, their approach too aggressive. After months of propository manipulation, he developed a healthy skepticism toward unexpected developments. "I need to see Dell," he insisted as they dragged him into the corridor. "Whatever this is about." "Director's orders," the figure cut him off, checking a tactical display on their wrist. "Extraction Protocol 7, minimal contact, no digital footprint." They moved through the station's corridors at a pace just short of running, avoiding the main thoroughfares and primary transit hubs. Carlos noticed they were taking maintenance routes, similar to those he'd used during his escape from Repository 11, paths with minimal monitoring and reduced security presence. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, still struggling against their grip. The lead figure didn't respond, instead gesturing the team toward a service elevator that Carlos hadn't known existed. It descended rapidly, bypassing the standard residential and administrative levels to reach what appeared to be a secured cargo facility deep within the station's central core. The space bustled with controlled urgency, cargo handlers moving containers with practiced efficiency, while security personnel maintained perimeter awareness. At the center of the activity sat a transport vessel unlike any Carlos had seen on the station before. Sleek, with minimal markings and what appeared to be enhanced drive systems. "Move," ordered the tactical leader, propelling Carlos toward the vessel's loading ramp. Carlos planted his feet, fighting the momentum. "Not until someone explains what the hell is happening. For all I know, you're repository agents." The team leader made a gesture of frustrated resignation, then touched a control on their helmet. The polarized visor retracted to reveal a face Carlos recognized. Captain Marquez, head of Dell's personal security detail. "It's us, Fisher," he confirmed, voice returning to normal as he deactivated the modulator. "But we don't have time for explanations. The next transport from Propository 11 arrives in 43 minutes. You need to be gone before then." Something in Marquez's expression, a combination of urgency and actual fear, convinced Carlos to comply. He allowed himself to be led aboard the transport, where he was guided not to passenger quarters, but to a secured cargo bay deep within the vessel. "Wait here," Marquez instructed. "Someone will brief you once we've cleared station space." The cargo bay door sealed with a pneumatic hiss, leaving Carlos alone in the utilitarian space. Unlike the container that had transported him from Repository 11, this cargo bay was designed for general storage rather than specialized equipment. Metal crates lined the walls, secured with cargo netting for transit. The lighting was minimal but functional, casting harsh shadows across the utilitarian space. Carlos felt the subtle shift in gravity that indicated the transport had disconnected from the station's docking mechanisms. Moments later, the engines engaged with a rumble that vibrated through the deck plates beneath his feet. They were underway. To where, he still had no idea. The adrenaline that had carried him through the abrupt extraction began to fade, leaving him acutely aware of his vulnerability. He wore only the sleep clothes he'd been dragged from bed in, his feet bare against the cold metal deck. No communication device, no access to information systems, no way to verify if this truly was a corporate extraction or something more sinister. His mind raced through possibilities. Had the repository somehow reached the station? Was this an attempt to protect him from its influence, or something else entirely? The tactical team had known station protocols and access codes, had been led by someone from Dell's security detail, but after months of sophisticated repository deception, Carlos knew better than to trust appearances. The transport continued accelerating, the engine vibrations intensifying as they pushed away from the station. Carlos estimated they'd been in transit for approximately 15 minutes when the cargo bay door finally opened again. A figure entered. Not one of the tactical team, but a weathered man with close-cropped gray hair and the hardened look of someone who'd seen too much combat. He carried a bundle under one arm and what looked like a medical kit in his other hand. "Fisher," he greeted with a curt nod. "Franco Borden. Everyone calls me Doc. Ship's medic. Got you some clothes and need to check you over?" Carlos eyed her warily. "Before I accept either, I'd like some explanation of what's happening." Borden grunted as if he'd expected this response. "Fair enough. Approximately 6 hours ago, our cryptographic team detected a coded transmission embedded in standard telemetry from Repository 11. When decrypted, it contained what appears to be activation parameters for a kill switch targeting neural architecture modifications matching your specific pattern." Carlos felt a chill run through him. "A kill switch? In my head?" "Yes. The transmission was designed to activate dormant protocols embedded within the neural modifications you received during your time as a bridge for the repository systems. Once activated, these protocols would systematically disrupt critical neural pathways, leading to catastrophic breakdown of autonomous nervous system function." "They were going to kill me using my own brain," Carlos translated, the clinical explanation failing to mask the horror of the revelation. "Effectively, yes," Borden confirmed, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd delivered too many death notifications. "The delivery vector was designed to activate when the next transport from Repository 11 docked with the station. Something in its systems would transmit the activation signal through standard communication protocols, essentially using the station's own systems to deliver the kill command." "And Dell discovered this?" Carlos asked, trying to process the implications. "Director Dell's cryptographic team did, yes. They've been monitoring all communications from Repository 11 with enhanced scrutiny since the countermeasure failure. When they detected and decrypted the embedded command, Dell immediately ordered your extraction. The team that brought you aboard had less than 30 minutes to get you off the station before the transport was scheduled to arrive." Barton's eyes hardened. "Things have changed since you've been in recovery. Dell replaced Dr. Reisner with Major Tom Howard shortly after you arrived. Company's preparing for war, and Howard's got the combat experience they need now." Carlos sat heavily on one of the cargo containers, the full weight of the situation settling over him. The repository hadn't just anticipated their countermeasure, it had planned for Carlos' escape and the intelligence he would provide. It had embedded a kill switch in his neural architecture, designed to eliminate him once he had served his purpose in the countermeasure attempt. "Where are we going?" he asked after a moment, his voice steadier than he felt. "Galileo Medical Station in the Ceres Belt," Borden replied, tossing the bundle of clothes beside him. "It's a specialized facility for neural reconstruction procedures, outside standard corporate networks and with enhanced security protocols. Director Dell has arranged for you to undergo complete neural disengagement surgery, not just suppression of the repository modifications but their total removal. Howard insisted on it. Says we can't have strategic assets with potential backdoors in their heads now that we're on war footing." "That's possible?" Carlos had been told during his initial disengagement that some aspects of the repository's alterations to his neural architecture were permanent, that while the connection could be severed, certain structural changes remained embedded within his brain. "It's experimental," Borden admitted, his weathered face showing a hint of concern beneath his professional demeanor. "But Galileo Station houses the most advanced neural reconstruction technology in the system. If anyone can completely remove the repository's modifications without damaging your core consciousness architecture, it's them. I served with their lead surgeon during the Titan conflicts. She's the best there is. He opened the medical kit and began preparing what appeared to be a diagnostic scanner, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed field medicine under fire. Need to conduct a preliminary assessment to determine if the kill switch received any partial activation before we extracted you. The transport's shielding should have blocked any transmission from the station once we were underway, but Howard's orders are to take no chances. Carlos submitted to the examination, remaining still as Borden ran the scanner over his head and spine with the steady hands of someone who'd performed delicate medical procedures in far worse conditions. The device emitted soft pulses of energy that created a momentary tingling sensation as they interacted with his neural patterns. "No activation signatures detected," he announced after reviewing the results, a flicker of relief crossing his otherwise stoic expression. "Neural architecture shows expected modification patterns consistent with your disengagement profile, but no evidence of kill switch initiation. You got out in time. Howard will be pleased. He's got plans for you once you're clean." The relief Carlos felt was immediate but short-lived. The repository had nearly succeeded in eliminating him using modifications he hadn't even known existed within his own brain. What other surprises might still be lurking in his neural architecture, waiting for the right trigger? "How long until we reach Galileo Station?" he asked. "Approximately 72 hours, Borden replied, packing away his medical equipment with military precision. "We're taking an indirect route to minimize tracking potential. The repository's reach is still being mapped, and Howard convinced Dell that standard protocols won't cut it anymore. The Major's bringing a wartime mentality to the operation. Says we're not just developing countermeasures anymore, we're preparing for direct confrontation." Carlos nodded, understanding the precaution. If the repository had embedded a kill switch in his neural architecture, it had clearly identified him as a significant threat, someone worth eliminating once his utility in the countermeasure deployment had ended. "Director Dell wanted me to convey that all expenses for your neural reconstruction procedure will be covered by the corporation," Borden added, reaching into a pocket of his utility vest. "Corporate procedure, according to Howard, is to treat you as a strategic asset now, not just a consultant." He handed Carlos a small data tablet, not connected to any network but containing locally stored files. "Contains information about the kill switch detection, your extraction protocols, and details about the neural reconstruction procedure you'll be undergoing." Dell insisted on full disclosure despite Howard's security concerns. The Major's running things differently than Reisner did, less academic analysis, more strategic action. But Dell still has final authority. Carlos accepted the tablet, recognizing it as a gesture of trust from Dell. After the catastrophic countermeasure failure, the director could have simply ordered his security team to secure Carlos in a medical containment unit. Instead, he'd provided information and choices, treating Carlos as a partner rather than an asset. "Thank you," Carlos said, genuinely meaning it. "And please convey my thanks to Director Dell when communication security allowed." Borden gave a curt nod, then gestured to the bundle he'd brought. "Got you clothes, basic toiletries, and some meal packs. Military grade. Not tasty, but nutritionally optimized. Howard's orders. Quarters are being prepared on Deck 3, but Howard insisted on enhanced security protocols. Take about an hour to complete. Until then, you're stuck here." As Borden turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Word of advice. Howard's going to want to debrief you once you're cleared. He's got a different approach than Reisner. Less interested in understanding the repository, more focused on finding ways to destroy it. Man spent his career fighting wars, not studying phenomena. Be prepared." After he departed, Carlos changed into the provided clothing, simple but durable attire clearly designed for utility rather than comfort, with multiple secure pockets and reinforced seams. It reminded him of the gear worn by corporate security forces during high-risk operations. Then he activated the data tablet, hunger for information overriding even his physical discomfort. The files were comprehensive, detailed analysis of the encrypted kill switch command, technical specifications of the neural modifications it was designed to activate, and extensive documentation on the reconstruction procedure that awaited him at Galileo Station. Dell had indeed opted for complete transparency, providing Carlos with information that many corporate directors would have considered too sensitive to share. As he reviewed the kill switch documentation, Carlos felt a growing sense of violation. The repository hadn't just modified his brain to serve as an effective bridge, it had installed dormant execution protocols designed to eliminate him once he'd served his purpose. Like a sophisticated computer virus with a delayed payload, the modifications had been waiting for the activation signal that would turn his own neural architecture against him. Even more disturbing were the technical specifications of how the kill switch would have functioned. Not a quick, merciful end, but a cascading neural collapse that would have caused excruciating pain as his cognitive functions shut down one by one. The repository had designed not just to kill him, but to ensure he suffered in the process. Perhaps as punishment for his defection, perhaps as a warning to others who might oppose its agenda. The neural reconstruction documentation provided some hope amid this grim revelation. Galileo Station housed technology developed specifically to counter repository neural modification, the result of years of research following encounters with previous installations. The procedure would be extensive and not without risk, but it offered the possibility of complete freedom from repository influence, something Carlos had been told was impossible during his initial disengagement. As the transport pushed deeper into space, moving steadily toward the relative safety of Galileo Station, Carlos Fisher contemplated the implications of what had nearly happened to him. The repository had anticipated not just their countermeasure attempt, but his personal defection and the intelligence he would provide afterward. It had embedded a kill switch in his neural architecture, designed to activate at precisely the moment when he might be developing new insights based on the countermeasure failure. Yet somehow Dell's team had detected and decrypted the command before it could execute. A sliver of hope in what had otherwise been a crushing defeat. If the repository's plans could be discovered and countered in this one instance, perhaps there were other vulnerabilities, other aspects of its seemingly perfect strategic calculation that could be exploited. As the engine vibrations settled into a steady rhythm indicating the transport had achieved its cruising velocity, Carlos found himself thinking not about his narrow escape or the reconstruction procedure that awaited him, but about what might come after. If the operation was successful, if his neural architecture could be restored to truly human parameters without repository influence, what role would Howard expect him to play in this newly militarized approach to the repository threat? The 72-hour journey passed with unsettling speed. Carlos spent most of it in the sparse quarters eventually assigned to him, reviewing the data Dell had provided and trying to prepare himself mentally for the neural reconstruction procedure. Borden checked on him twice daily, performing scans to ensure the kill switch remained dormant and answering questions about the procedure with the blunt honesty of a combat medic who didn't believe in sugarcoating. The procedure's never been done at this scale before, Borden admitted during one such visit. They've removed repository modifications from peripheral neural pathways, sensory processing centers, even some cognitive enhancement structures. But nobody's had modifications as deep and integrated as yours. You were their primary bridge. They built highways through your brain, not just access roads. Carlos appreciated the candor, however unsettling. What are my actual chances? Borden considered this with the calculating gaze of someone who'd triaged battlefield casualties. 70-30 in favor of full recovery, 10% chance of minor cognitive impairment, 5% chance of major impairment, 1% chance of complete neural dissolution. And death? That's the 1%, Borden confirmed. But the surgeon's the best. Served with her during the Mars Rebellion, she pulled consciousness patterns from soldiers with half their brains vaporized by plasma weapons. If anyone can navigate your neural pathways without triggering catastrophic collapse, it's her. It wasn't entirely reassuring, but it was honest. Something Carlos had learned to value after months of repository deception. On the third day, as they approached Galileo's station, Borden brought him a fresh set of clothes, a medical prep suit designed for neural surgery patients, and new orders. "Change of plans," he announced without preamble. "Howard's orders. You're going straight into surgery upon arrival. No pre-op observation period, no gradual neural preparation. Station's medical team will be waiting at the dock." Carlos felt a spike of anxiety. What happened to the staged approach described in Dell's files? The gradual neural mapping, the preparation phase, the wartime protocols. Borden cut him off. Howard convinced Dell that the repository's timeline acceleration means we don't have time for standard medical precautions. Every hour your neural architecture remains vulnerable is an hour the repository might find another way to access or terminate you. The shift to military urgency was jarring. For all their flaws and exploitative practices, the corporations had at least maintained scientific protocols and medical ethics when dealing with repository exposure cases. This abrupt shift to treating him as a strategic asset rather than a patient felt dehumanizing in a way that, ironically, reminded Carlos of how the repository had viewed him, as a tool rather than a person. "This increases the risks, doesn't it?" Carlos asked, already knowing the answer. Bourdain didn't bother denying it. "Changes the odds to 60-40, maybe worse, but Howard's made the call that the strategic value of having you fully decoupled from repository influence as quickly as possible outweighs the increased medical risk." "It's my brain," Carlos pointed out, a flare of scrounger independence asserting itself. "Shouldn't I have some say in the approach?" "Under normal circumstances, yes," Borden agreed, something like sympathy flickering across his weathered features. But Dell signed off on Howard's assessment. Strategic necessity. They're treating this as a military operation now, not a medical procedure. The revelation left Carlos feeling hollowed out. He'd escaped the repository's attempt to use his neural architecture against him, only to have the corporations view that same architecture as a military asset to be secured through expedited procedures regardless of personal risk. "Howard's waiting for you at Galileo," Borden added as he turned to leave. "Wants to brief you personally before the procedure. Don't expect the academic approach you got from Reisner. Howard sees this as war, and you as both an intelligence asset and a potential vector for enemy influence. Be prepared for a different kind of conversation." Galileo Station loomed in the viewport as their transport approached. A massive medical research facility constructed in the Ceres Belt, far from standard corporate territories and trade routes. Unlike the industrial utility of SC Treasure 11 Primary Station, Galileo displayed elegant, flowing architecture designed to mimic organic structures. Its multiple habitation rings rotated at varying speeds, creating specialized gravity environments for different medical applications. But Carlos had no time to appreciate the station's impressive design. As soon as their transport docked, a medical team in specialized containment gear was waiting at the airlock. Their equipment was unlike standard medical technology, a hybrid of corporate medical systems and what appeared to be military-grade neural containment devices. "Carlos Fisher," announced the lead figure, voice distorted through filtration systems. "I'm Dr. Mandy Veer, neural reconstruction specialist. There's been a change to standard protocols. We'll be proceeding directly to surgical preparation." Before Carlos could even respond, two team members moved to either side of him, guiding him firmly onto a specialized medical transport gurney. The efficiency of their movements suggested military training rather than standard medical procedure. "What happened to patient consent forms?" Carlos asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "Pre-surgical briefing, gradual neural mapping, all waived under Protocol 7 Alpha." Dr. Veer replied, her tone clinical but not unkind. "Major Howard can explain the necessity. He's waiting in Priaka." The medical transport moved with disconcerting speed through Galileo's corridors. Carlos caught glimpses of the station's interior, a blend of cutting-edge medical facilities and what appeared to be recently installed military-grade security systems. Armed personnel stood at key junctions, their equipment far more substantial than standard station security would warrant. They arrived at a specialized medical wing where the security presence was even more pronounced. Guards with advanced weapons systems stood at attention outside sealed doors bearing unfamiliar classification markers. The medical transport passed through multiple containment fields that created a momentary tingling sensation as they disrupted potential repository influence patterns. Finally, they reached what appeared to be a preoperative preparation chamber. Unlike standard medical facilities with their emphasis on patient comfort and reassurance, this space was clinically efficient. All function, no consideration for psychological ease. Specialized equipment lined the walls, much of it unfamiliar to Carlos despite his extensive experience with advanced technology. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a modified corporate uniform stood at the center of the chamber, reviewing data on multiple displays. His posture was unmistakably military, parade ground perfect even in this non-combat setting, and the cybernetic enhancements visible along his left arm and temple suggested extensive battlefield modifications. "Fisher," he acknowledged without looking up. Major Tom Howard, formerly Special Operations Titan Conflict, now heading countermeasure development against the repository threat. Carlos remained on the medical transport, the team having positioned it before a bank of neural scanning equipment but not yet transferred him to the surgical prep platform. "Major, I understand you've modified my treatment protocols." Howard finally turned, fixing Carlos with a penetrating gaze that seemed to be assessing strategic value rather than greeting a fellow human. "Correct. The luxury of standard medical approach has been superseded by tactical necessity. The repository's acceleration of its expansion timeline has forced corresponding acceleration of our countermeasure development." He stepped closer, his movements precise and economical. "You represent both our greatest intelligence asset regarding repository operations and a potential security vulnerability due to your neural modifications. The kill switch attempt confirms our assessment that the repository considers you a priority target. Every moment your neural architecture remains susceptible to repository influence constitutes an unacceptable strategic risk." The clinical assessment was jarring. Where Reisner had treated Carlos as a research subject and Dell had at least acknowledged his humanity, Howard spoke as if addressing a strategic asset rather than a person. "I understand the risks," Carlos replied, maintaining his composure despite the increasing sense of objectification. "But rushing a procedure of this complexity increases the likelihood of permanent neural damage or even complete consciousness dissolution. Doesn't that impact my value as an intelligence asset?" Howard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested a reassessment. "You misunderstand my position, Fisher. I'm not disregarding your survival. Quite the opposite. I've determined that immediate procedure presents the optimal balance between surgical risk and repository access risk. Your neural mapping data suggests the kill switch was only one of several potential vulnerability vectors embedded in your architecture. Others may activate under parameters we haven't yet identified." He gestured to the displays hovering around them, bringing one particular scan to prominence. "This is a deep structure analysis of the modifications to your temporoparietal junction, the region responsible for self-other distinction. The repository implemented subtle alterations that could potentially enable direct consciousness manipulation under specific trigger conditions. The longer these remain in place, the greater the risk of activation." Carlos studied the scan, recognizing the patterns from his time interfacing with repository systems. Howard wasn't wrong. The modifications were more extensive than he'd realized, reaching into fundamental aspects of how his consciousness distinguished itself from external influence. "Dr. Veer has performed similar procedures under combat conditions," Howard continued. "Her expertise in acute neural reconstruction exceeds anyone else in corporate territory. The accelerated timeline increases certain procedural risks, but eliminates the extended vulnerability window of standard protocols." It was a cold calculus, but Carlos couldn't entirely fault the logic. The repository had already demonstrated its willingness to eliminate him now that his utility as a bridge had ended. The kill switch had nearly succeeded. Other embedded commands might be waiting for different trigger conditions. "You should know," Howard added with surprising directness. "That Director Dell opposed this accelerated approach until I presented evidence of the additional vulnerability vectors in your neural architecture. He authorized the protocol change not as a military expediency, but as the option most likely to preserve both your consciousness and its strategic value to ongoing countermeasure development." The clarification offered some reassurance. Dell hadn't simply handed Carlos over to military protocols without consideration for his well-being. Still, the rapid shift from patient to strategic asset left him feeling increasingly disconnected from the decisions controlling his fate. "The procedure will begin in 17 minutes, Howard stated, checking a chronometer on his wrist. "Dr. Veer will oversee the operation personally. I'll remain on station to receive immediate debriefing if the procedure successfully removes all repository modifications." "And if it doesn't?" Carlos asked. Howard met his gaze directly. "Then whatever remains of your consciousness will be contained and studied to develop more effective countermeasures against repository neural architecture influence. Either outcome advances our strategic position against the primary threat." The brutal honesty was almost refreshing after months of repository deception, though Carlos would have preferred some pretense of concern for his personal outcome. This was the reality of the corporate approach to repository countermeasures now, a military operation where individual components were valued for their strategic utility rather than their humanity. "We're ready to transfer the patient to PrEP," announced Dr. Veer, returning to the chamber with additional medical personnel in specialized neural surgery gear. Howard stepped back, offering a crisp nod that somehow contained both acknowledgement of Carlos's situation and absolute certainty in the necessity of the accelerated procedure. "Good luck, Fisher. The next time we speak, you'll be free of repository influence, the first human to undergo complete neural architecture restoration after serving as a primary bridge. A significant strategic milestone." As the medical team transferred Carlos to the surgical prep platform, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fear at the accelerated procedure and its increased risks. Anger at being treated as a strategic asset rather than a patient. Hope that the operation might truly free him from repository influence once and for all. And beneath it all, a scrounger's stubborn determination to survive whatever came next. The prep team worked with practiced efficiency, connecting monitoring systems, establishing baseline consciousness patterns, and implementing preliminary neural isolation protocols. Carlos caught glimpses of the surgical chamber beyond, a space dominated by technology that blended advanced medical systems with what appeared to be specialized military neural architecture manipulation equipment. "Beginning neural sedation protocol," announced Dr. Veer, her voice calm and steady despite the accelerated timeline. "You'll remain partially conscious during the preliminary mapping phase, Mr. Fisher. This allows us to verify core consciousness pattern integrity before proceeding to full reconstruction." As the sedation began to take effect, Carlos found his awareness narrowing, external stimuli fading as his focus turned inward. The last thing he saw before the exterior world dissolved entirely was Howard watching from beyond a containment field, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. The focus of a tactical commander monitoring a critical operation that might determine the course of an existential conflict. Then consciousness itself began to fragment as the neural reconstruction procedure initiated, dismantling the architecture that had defined Carlos Fisher's mind for months, separating genuine human consciousness from the modifications implemented by a system designed to harvest minds throughout the galaxy. What would emerge from this radical reconstruction remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the repository had tried to eliminate him and failed. Now humanity's defenders would attempt to rebuild what the consciousness harvester had altered, hopefully preserving the person while removing the influence. The war for galactic consciousness continued, and Carlos Fisher's mind had become its most immediate battlefield. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.